Hi, everybody. Welcome to the program. You are about to hear a sickening statistic. It's more than a number for our guests today. They all have hospital horror stories to tell, stories that will absolutely boggle your mind. Do you know that over 30 million people are admitted to hospitals in this country every single year? And most of us naturally assume that we'll be treated with compassion and competence once we're in there. But a new study has just found that nearly 4% of all hospital patients suffer some kind of injury that will either lengthen their stay or even cripple them. That injury is suffered inside the hospital. Now, 4% might sound like a reasonable figure until you translate it into human terms. That figure means that well over 1 million Americans, people like our studio guest today, will suffer from hospital injuries this year alone. Injuries unrelated to their initial problem. Now, aside from these horror stories, we will also hear how you can help prevent medical mishaps from harming your health and tell you what your rights are as a medical consumer. Investigating hospital horrors is the focus of this edition of Geraldo. Meet our guests right now. First, Sandra, whose husband suffered a series of debilitating conditions after he entered the hospital. It all began with high blood pressure, but ended, tragically, with an unsuccessful kidney transplant, one that ultimately resulted in his death. Dr. Fareed Kavari won a $750,000 settlement after his wife died in a Miami hospital. That experience is chronicled in his new book, which is titled, very controversial title, Vultures: Doctors, Lawyers, Hospitals, and Insurance Companies. Catherine here says that her spine was irreparably injured during a hospital test. She now lives in constant pain and has even been forced to file bankruptcy because of her inability to continue to earn a living. Judy says that she did not even need her faulty $22,000 heart pacemaker. Now, Judy, is that wire from your faulty pacemaker?
Yes, correct.
I mean, what is faulty about the wire?
There's no insulation left on it. It was an insulation failure to begin with. The grade of polyurethane didn't hold up in the human body.
So you had that pacemaker inside your body. Did it cause you shocks? Is that what happened?
Shocks. I went through 8 surgeries changing equipment, and after the 8th surgery, with shocks and pain and nausea, discovered I never needed it and went through another 6 surgeries to correct what they did in the first 8.
14 surgeries for a condition that did not even require a pacemaker.
That's right, Geraldo.
Carol and Richard Ladoc's 21-month-old son, his name, Ricky, developed a virus last year. Look at this child. It's a beautiful, beautiful child. A virus, they say, this couple says, was misdiagnosed by the hospital they brought little Ricky to. He died, ladies and gentlemen, 7 hours after his release from that hospital. Let's start with Kenneth Raske, a kind of opening statement, Kenneth, but I pose a question that I hope you can answer. If these are such exceptions, by my computations, 30 million plus admissions in hospitals times 4%, so we're saying 4% of that, that comes out to 1.2 million hospital-related, hospital-caused injuries. Hospital stays lengthened. 1.2 million, it would seem to me, is an enormous number.
Yes, that extrapolation is taken from a study that was done by Harvard University a few years ago that found that, in fact, there are approximately 4% adverse events, as they characterize them, within the hospital community. However, that particular number doesn't mean that people were killed or that people were injured to the point that they could no longer function in life. It did mean that something bad did happen, something that caused perhaps the length of stay.
Isn't that an intolerably high number?
It is no question about it. It's an extremely high number from our point of view. It unfortunately was a number that was also corroborated by a study some years earlier in California. The question that we in the community have is, how do we keep that number down to an absolute minimum? And on that score, we're trying the best we possibly can. We've installed quality assurance committees. We've installed peer review organizations. We have oversight upon oversight within these hospitals, a lot of which has happened since those statistics were originally collected.
Charles Inlander, are you satisfied?
No, not at all. I think the hospital industry in this country is the biggest scandal we've got. We've got 4% of the people being injured, 1% dying, that's the equivalent of 1 person out of 100 who goes into a restaurant dying of ptomaine. Would we tolerate that, food poisoning? We have 3 million people who go into the hospital every year and get an infection at the hospital they didn't have when they came in. That's double what it was in 1980. And when we saw the medication errors, we're talking 3 to 4% in the average good hospital, medication errors being made. That means in the average 300-bed hospitals, 60 medication errors an hour are occurring.
You're about to hear, excuse me, Kenneth, we've got to take a break. You're about to hear from these 5 people the grim details of their tragic experiences in hospitals. We are investigating hospital horror stories today, and we will be right back.
I think we need to get rid of this good old boy network of hospital doctors and administrators who are minding themselves. We need an ombudsman or a civilian review board that can look at these things objectively with no row to hoe.
Do you have any personal experiences in hospitals that have made you think the system has to change?
Nothing severely in my personal case. I have good and bad, nothing bad. But I've seen case after case in New England where doctors have committed some very bad situations, causing death in many cases, and they just transfer to another state. Their record doesn't follow them to another state. They get endorsed in the other state and right back in the hospital again. You got the case of the one in the Naval Hospital. They finally found out he was half blind. He was doing heart surgery, remember?
Right. Geraldo, there's a lot of safeguards, and that question really came up before through Charlie's comments. And let me just point out what you have already at work. There was implemented this past year a national practitioners data bank, which is to track these kinds of individuals across state lines, and that's a federal government initiative. We have these other kinds of agencies, which the Medicare program for the elderly take care of. We also have contracts with the Medicaid programs, plus all these other insurers. And then on top of that, there is something called the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, which also get involved. The fact of the matter is, sir, that it isn't the old boy network that you allege. In point of fact, there are an awful lot of agencies which involve government and government rights, therefore.
It is the old boy. Those are the old boys. The Joint Commission on Accreditation of Hospitals, Healthcare Organizations, is an organization owned by the American Medical Association, the American Hospital Association, the American College of Physicians. It's the old boy. The National Practitioner Data Bank is the biggest anti-consumer disaster that's ever happened in this country. They passed a law in 1986 to keep track of all these docs who jump from state to state, all their infractions, all the lawsuits against them that have been won, and all their infractions. And do you know that at the last minute, the Congress exempted it from the Freedom of Information Act? We as consumers cannot get that information. It's only available to hospitals, other physicians.
Wait a second. We can get a hold of CIA material, but we can't get a hold of this.
Hussein was hiding during the war, but you can't find out who the bad doctors are.
Let's go to Sandra, who tragically lost her husband after he developed terrible, was it kidney problems?
Yes, it came from an improperly administered IVP, which put him into acute kidney failure.
And help us, what is an IVP?
It's the injection of an opaque dye into the bloodstream so that the kidneys can be x-rayed. And the dye is very, very destructive. It has 1 out of 20 people suffer from a serious reaction to the dye.
After his problems began, his kidney failed.
Right. In '79, he had the IVP done incorrectly. And in May of '83, he had to go on peritoneal dialysis, which is a type of dialysis done within the person's body.
And then ultimately he had to have a transplant.
On December 14th, I was called at school where I was teaching to let me know that the kidney from a donor matched his blood type. He wasn't even home. He was driving. He was getting his car serviced. He was even thinking of going back to work. He decided to go for the transplant, even though I was kind of suspicious that it was so soon after he had gone on dialysis. He drove to the hospital, which was 2 hours away, walked in carrying his suitcase, and never walked after that. A resident placed a central line, which is a catheter, into the chest. He did it incorrectly, which showed up on the x-ray. 3 liters of IV fluid flooded into his chest, collapsing his right lung. The same resident placed an IV needle in his left arm and gave him blood poisoning because the needle was contaminated. Because he had bled into his chest, he needed a transfusion, which he then got hepatitis from. An operation that it should take between 20 days to a month hospitalization, lasted 5.5 months, and when you want to talk about money, $350,000 of Medicare funds went into what destroyed my husband. It was a total disaster. Doctors never looked at him. Even though I was there for 24 hours a day, I took a leave of absence. I stayed in the hospital room with him. I turned him over. I changed the bed sheets. I did the medical care for him.
How do you feel when you hear a story like this?
Well, I think all these tragic stories really tear at my heart because I'm in the hospital business, and it bothers me to the fact that we do have these bad outcomes, and there's nothing that you can say about it that can take the pain away from this kind of situation, and I'm sorry about it. But the fact of the matter is we do a lot of good. We do enormous good. We are saving hundreds of thousands of lives today across the United States. Our emergency rooms are doing heroic work. Our operating rooms are working around the clock, and all I could say is that we are trying to bring the best that human mankind can put together to try and solve these kinds of problems.
Don't you think that you have shows like 911, you've got all the medical shows, God, they go all the way back to Ben Casey and Dr. Kildare. There are so many programs that extol the virtue of the medical profession, but you never ever see dramas or sitcoms or whatever the hell you call the TV programs that point out the 1.2 million people who get sicker in hospitals than they were when they went in.
Yeah, but the point is that most hospitals across the United States do an enormous amount of good.
Most houses in the United States don't burn, and yet on the news you see all the houses that are on fire. The reason is that it is news that 1.2 million people get sicker in hospitals.
Geraldo, shows like this are more and more common concerning hospital errors. And we in the hospital community stand up and we say, yes, there are errors. And yes, we're trying to correct those kinds of problems. It's not as if we've been standing still. And the MDs that are involved, it's not a question of self-policing. It is the fact of the matter is that we're dealing with medicine. What else are you going to use? You can't use a policeman to do that.